and I hope that everybody has enjoyed the wonderful talk of Professor Abu Zayd, and I don't have much to add to what he said. In most of what he said, we look eye to eyes, and the only thing that I can mention here is that the book, which is now on the presentation desk, my recent book about the expansion of prophetic experience, does contain the gist of the matter that I am going to tell you here. You will find a much more elaborated version of my point in that book. So much for the advertisement of the book. Now, let me just point out to maybe two important things which I think perhaps Professor Abu Zayd maybe has not taken into consideration seriously, or perhaps if he admits it into his theory would make it even more perfect than it is now. Of course, he has put his finger on one of the main topics in the Qur'an, and that is the issue of ambiguity and clarity in the Qur'an. As we know, there are only two classifications in the Qur'an made about the verses of the Qur'an. The rest are, of course, done by scholars of the Qur'an, by mufassirin and interpreters. The first classification is the classification of clear verses and ambiguous verses. Although this translation may not sound very accurate, but we have to use it. As you know, it is in the verse 7 of the chapter 3, Al Imran, that we read that إِنَّا أَنزَلْنَا إِلَيْكَ الْكِتَابَ مِنْهَا آيَاتٌ مُحْكَمَاتٌ هُنَّ أُمُّ الْكِتَابِ وَأُخَرُ مُتَشَابِهَاتٌ. The book contains two classes of verses, the ambiguous and the clear ones. I understand from what Professor Abu Zayd says and from most of our interpreters that this has been deliberate on the part of God, or perhaps on the part of Muhammad, as the case may be. Whoever is the author of the Quran, I am not going to take side with anybody here. But the depth of the matter is important here. Most of our interpreters, I think, including Professor Abu Zayd, take it to mean that it was a deliberate action on the part of God or Muhammad to divide the verses of the Quran, or to reveal them to Muhammad in two different classes. Some of them are clear to him and to other people, and some of them are not that clear. In the sense that if God wanted, he could do differently. He could make the whole Quran clear, or perhaps he could make it, completely and totally ambiguous. But now he has decided, for whatever reason, for whatever expediency, to fill it with these two different classes of verses, ambiguous and clear. Here I would like to differ from him and others. I don't think so, and I think it was, again, very clever of Muhammad, or perhaps of his God, to say this, to acknowledge that Quran contains clear and ambiguous verses. This is a very important hermeneutical principle. Language in itself, by its very nature, inherently is ambiguous. And this ambiguity, whether God is the speaker, or Muhammad, or human beings, or whoever, this ambiguity is always there. You cannot avoid it, and you cannot eliminate it. This was taken by most of the of interpreters later, but as I said, they did not, use it in the proper way. They thought that perhaps it was a decision made by God to do this, but that is something which I would like to say that perhaps it is not the case. I think even in early Islamic era, Muslims did realize this fact, did recognize this principle, because not only in the Quran, but according to the Muslim traditions, we have got the same thing, the same categories applicable to sayings of Prophet himself, the non-Quranic sayings of the Prophet. In the Shi'i tradition, which I come from, The same categories apply to the sayings of imams, of the 12 imams. Therefore, this shows that they did, actually understand it this way, that this is part or one of the characteristics, one of the fundamental characteristics of the nature of the language, to be both clear and ambiguous. So, therefore, I would like to expand it and to generalize it. Maybe you wouldn't find such a verse in the Bible, but definitely the Bible can be classified and can be divided into two classes of verses, ambiguous and clear. Not only the scriptures and the divinely books, you can apply the same principle to books written by mystics, to poetry especially. I mean, all of us are familiar with poetry. I come from Iran, and the Persian language is a poetical language, as all of you know, and we have got very great mystic poets, especially Rumi, who is very well known, and actually he himself applies the same categories to his poetry. And he says that part of my poetry are clear, are muhkam, and part are not, are ambiguous. Therefore, the categories are much more general, and Qur'an is just one instance of the same thing. And that was taken later by interpreters. And that's why the Qur'an is not a book of ideology, as Professor Abu Zayd, put it quite eloquently. It is a producer of meaning because of its inherent ambiguity. But ambiguity is not enough, because ambiguity can arise from ignorance, from incompetence. Now, therefore, you need another principle, another presupposition to add to the distinction between clear and ambiguous verses in order to make the scripture a productive book, a book producing of new meanings. And that is absent from what Professor Abu Zayd presented us here. I'm sure that he might have it in mind, but just I remind you of that. As I said, ambiguity can arise because of three reasons or three causes. No, I am not going into the philosophical issue, what is the difference between reasons and causes, but anyway, can arise, because of three different, first, the incompetence of the speaker, of the author, of the writer. Second, the inherent ambiguity of the nature of the language. And third, which, as I said, was absent from the presentation of Professor Abu Nasr, is the depth of the experience of the author. Now, here we have to take that into context, and this is something which our mystics, our spiritual, actually men has mentioned it, and without that, actually, ambiguity cannot mean anything. Ambiguity will be a defect rather than a perfection in the Quran, in the scriptures. Now, I think all of us now, and I speak now from within the tradition of Islam, Islamic tradition, that according to our mystics, the prophetic experience was originally a mystical experience, a spiritual vision, a transcendental experience, if you like. And because of that, now he had moments, let us say, with God, in which he did not see anything except God. I think even if we are non-believers, and even if we look, just positivistically, let us say, into the history of Islam, this much cannot be denied, that the Prophet of Islam, Muhammad, had such moments, had such visions, in which for him there was no entity existing in the whole world except God. Nay, but God was the world, and the world was him. I mean, these two were not two different things. And from that level, from the height of his experience, when he looked into the world, he did not make the distinction that we make. That was the depth of the experience. We make the distinction between the free will and predestination. We make the distinction between this world and the next world. We make the distinction between God and human beings. But at that moment, definitely he did not have none of these things in his mind. The world became so transparent to him and God shining through the world that he only looked at him and saw him and nothing else. I think the verse of light in the Surah An-Nur is very, very clear in this respect. It explains to us one of the rare experiences, mystical experiences of Muhammad. Of course, God is light was already there in the gospel, in the Bible, but the rest of the verse, you cannot find it. It is the experience of Muhammad. مثل نوره كمشكاة فيها مصباح المصباح في زجاجة الزجاجة كأنها كوكب دري يوقد من شجرة مباركة زيتونة لا شرقية ولا غربية. It's very beautiful, but the beauty of the experience is this, that the whole world is like a bulb in which there lies a lamp. You see, the lamp is God, and the whole world is so transparent, so luminous, that only God shines through it. And because of that height of experience, he did see and he did recognize and he did understand things that when he was a completely human being, he could not have it. And this explains actually the ambiguity, because of the ambiguity of the mysteries that he witnessed. It was not only the ambiguity of the language, which was partially responsible for the ambiguity of the text, but it was also the ambiguity and the unclarity of the mystical, mysterious experience that he entertained at the time of his, metaphysical visions that he had. And this again explains another thing in the Qur'an, and that is this. The conflict and the contradictions in the Qur'an, which Professor Abu Zayd bases his arguments on that. Certainly there are contradictions, conflicts, and tensions, not only within the Qur'an, but also between Qur'an and maybe human achievements, like the conflict of science and revelation in the case of Christianity. These conflicts can be explained both on the basis of the ambiguity of the language and on the basis of the, let us say, ambiguity of the experience that the Prophet had. On the higher levels, you would not find much difference between a human being who is predestined or who has got free will. This is in this world that we live. And actually the Prophet sometimes descended from his heights of experience into the human world. And that's why the contradictions appear. When he was talking to us from his human experience, he talked about punishment, rewards, about free will, about predestination, and things like that. And then these contradictions appeared. But when he was at the height of his experience, he did not see any contradiction in what he said and what he did. I may add to all this what I am saying. Let me mention, I'm sorry, I am trespassing my limits, violating your rights, but let me just add a few points. And I remember from Rumi, whose name I brought up here. He says, this is a very good allegory he gives us. He says, suppose that a chicken invites a camel into his or her nest. Guess what happens? This is exactly what happens to the Prophet. The camel of experience enters the chicken's nest. Things will be torn apart. And because things becomes torn apart, the language also becomes torn apart. The language also becomes perplexed. And this is exactly the word that Rumi used. He says that sometimes I am perplexed, and because of that, the language is also perplexed. And because of that, you wouldn't find a clear meaning. Therefore, instead of unclarity and uncertainty, perhaps I would suggest to use the word perplexity of language. And this perplexity of language, you will find it not only in the Qur'an, but as I said, in other things. Now coming to the historicity of the Qur'an, just one point, and then I will end. And that one point is, in the historicity of the Qur'an, we take into account everything in the historical period of the Prophet, in anthropology, in sociology, everything which are there. I mean, quite clearly, they are visible in the language of Qur'an and the experience of Muhammad when he was completely human, was not annihilated in the divine. But usually we do not take into account, again, the philosophical consideration that later philosophers actually has offered us. This comes from Al-Farabi, and then you see the echo of it in Maimonides, and then in Spinoza. For Spinoza, as all of us are aware of this, prophets were given a very special, specific characteristic, and that was the powerful imagination. This, of course, comes from Al-Farabi. It was not only the intellectual power of the prophets that was powerful, but also, and more importantly, their imaginal power. They had a very powerful imagination. And because of that, they were able to form the formless. To form the formless. And here comes in Ibn Rushd, as you mentioned, because when he wants to decipher, verses like punishment, like when he talks about Jannah, about, the paradise, about the hell, and the sort of, punishment, all these are forms which has been put on the formless through the powerful imagination of the prophet. Taking all this into account, I think one can explain in a better light the ambiguity, the unclarity, the perplexity of the language which seemingly create contradictions and conflicts and tensions in the Quran, and opens the gate to a much wider horizon of meanings in the case of the Quran, not only Quran, but all mystical, poetical writings and materials. Thank you very much for your patience. Forgive me for the perplexity of the language.